Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of NHLN Opinion Plus, a weekly series airing every Friday. This is a space for our opinions where we talk about current events and questions the Latino community is curious about. Today, we are joined by Lisa Beaudoin, Executive Director of ABLE New Hampshire. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. How are you doing?
I'm well. It's Friday. It's another beautiful day in paradise, and I have a great job, so no complaints.
Absolutely, I can completely agree. So some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today are disability justice and the impact of COVID on ABLE's mission these past several years, and the complexities of equality for these different groups. So any questions before we begin?
No.
Absolutely. Awesome. So Lisa, we would like to start off by asking, how has the impact of the pandemic changed the way ABLE has pursued their mission?
Yeah. So ABLE New Hampshire's mission is to advocate for full civil and human rights for people living with disabilities. We do this by influencing lawmakers and other decision makers. We do community organizing work so that people who are impacted by disability are actually pushing for the systems change that they believe needs to happen based on their lived experience. And we mobilize folks to respond. COVID has made it really difficult because people with disabilities already face many barriers to accessing ordinary parts of community life. And more generally, people with disabilities have difficulty accessing the American dream the way everybody else does. So the isolation of COVID has made it really difficult for ABLE New Hampshire to do its community organizing work. Of course, we pivoted and adopted Zoom very quickly and responded to the needs of the community, but people with disabilities have been adversely and more greatly impacted by COVID, and we've had to change a lot of things.
Absolutely. So can you explain more on like what type of programs that you've created for these, for children and adults that have disabilities, and how has the impact of working in a virtual setting, how has that impacted the type of learning or the type of services that they're receiving?
Sure. So ABLE New Hampshire is an advocacy organization. We don't provide direct supports and services, but in order to provide people with disabilities the tools they need to shape their stories, to meet with decision makers, whether it's an elected official in their town or a state elected official or a federal official, like anybody who has an opportunity to work on policies that impact people with disabilities, getting them the tools they need is tougher if we're doing it through Zoom. So we've had to convert all of our community organizing trainings to be modified for Zoom or other online video training systems. We've had to work twice as hard to get people with disabilities connected to decision makers in their communities. And we've had to do a lot of response education. So for families with students with disabilities who have individualized education plans, that posed an enormous problem for parents. Students with disabilities need supports to be staged for success when they graduate. We had to do 2 different trainings to make sure that parents understood that their special education rights for their student were not lost in the mix in the move toward online learning. And a lot of students with disabilities didn't do well with online learning, and they lost a lot of their supports and services. So ABLE had to help connect families to their school administrators, as well as to the New Hampshire Department of Education, as well as to elected officials to say, hey, things are not going well for students with disabilities. And we had to not only, again, give parents tools, but we also needed to let decision makers know you can't forget students with disabilities while you're making the move to online learning.
Interesting, very, very interesting. So with that, you mentioned that you're an advocacy organization. You really try to connect the families that are in need, those with disabilities, to the educators and also to the legislators. Can you explain more on, do you see any differences with meeting the needs of certain groups of people with disabilities, such as people of communities of color, communities of low socioeconomic status? Do you see any barriers with supporting, like, let's say, Latinx students with disabilities versus those are from the Black and Brown community?
Sure. So what we know from outcomes for Black and Brown students and the Latinx communities is that their academic and social emotional outcomes, if there are students with special education needs, they don't have as good outcomes. And we have to spend a lot of time trying to support, provide tools and training to low SES and communities of color so that they can be represented at school board meetings, at town meetings, so that their voices get elevated and that their particular needs get heard. Because when you start intersecting race and disability, the outcomes become more grim. So particularly in Manchester, our ABLE chapter in Manchester really works hard to make sure that more vulnerable populations get time at the microphone.
Absolutely. So to clarify what you said, you mentioned that these communities of color and Latinx and Black and Brown communities, they have a hard time trying to raise awareness on the issues that they specifically face simply because of their unique background from a legislative perspective. So
Yeah,
can you mhm. So can you
yeah.
explain more
So
on why they do that? Can you explain more on why specifically them, and what about their white counterparts?
yeah. Well, the bottom line is New Hampshire is very white and very racist, right? I mean, that's a struggle that we are constantly trying to um, face and unpack, right? So when we think about students with disabilities, the overwhelming majority of them in New Hampshire are white. So we have to spend a lot of extra time working to make sure that we highlight, both as an organization as well as in when we're out there organizing families, we have to make sure that we provide a lot of space so that uh, students with disabilities who are students of color, that their parents get the tools that they need to advocate within the individualized education planning team meetings so that their students actually get what they need. And then we need those same parents to go and tell the stories that not only are their students facing barriers to education because of their race, but when you couple that with disability, it is that much more challenging to get equitable access to education, particularly in Manchester.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a lot about Manchester, how it is a very disadvantaged community. Can you explain more on, like, what is the history of Manchester and why is it so difficult for not just people of color, but also people of color with disabilities to be able to succeed and to reach their full potential?
Sure. So, that's a tough question to answer because in my mind, it's like racism and ableism provide culture stories that other Black and Brown folks, as well as people with disabilities. And so, teachers accidentally have lower expectations of students with disabilities and students of color because we have the background hum of racism and ableism teaching us to expect less, right? So that's very problematic. In Manchester, like most of the rest of the state, New Hampshire was very, very white until we had a refugee resettlement program in the early 90s. And Manchester went from being a nearly all white city to a city with lots of new folks who didn't speak English and who looked really different and brought different cultural norms. And in part, this was a bit of a shock for Manchester, despite the best efforts to plan for the kinds of supports. But you know that didn't go as smoothly as planned, and it's been challenging for Manchester to get past. Um, uh, it's racism. I mean, that's really the easiest way. Courageous conversations take time and commitment, and it takes a lot of bravery for folks to sit down with people and listen deeply and learn about how the world um, should be an open place and a welcoming place for everyone.
Absolutely, and that's really interesting to see to hear because it's it just so happens that a lot of structures of society today tend to be structured to favor certain groups and to disfavor others. So with that, can you explain about the different programs that you have with through the Able Corporation to help educate these other groups, maybe to educate the white counterparts, the white communities on the issues that other communities face, or can you dive more into what you're doing in order to have people sit down and listen to one another and to be able to connect with people that are just different from them?
Sure. So ABLE has three statewide task forces. I'll talk about our inclusive education task force. And our inclusive education task force is really about moving equity in education. And we know that students of color and students with disability have the worst outcomes, academic and social emotional. So we work with other nonprofits to have conversations that bring Black and brown communities and white communities together to talk about how to pressure the Manchester School District into implementing school-wide transformation in Manchester. Because when you lift up equity for one group, you lift up equity for all groups. Because equity isn't just about students of color or low-income students or students with disability. Equity in education is designed so that we all get lifted together. That doesn't mean that we don't have some targeted programs to continue to address what does racism look like, what does ableism look like, what does homophobia look like. But when we bring together different groups like Granite State Organizing Project, Able New Hampshire, we talk to the teachers union, and we all get in the room and we're like, how do we force the school district to implement the programs to create school-wide transformation where we get equity-driven curriculum?
Absolutely. That is very, very interesting. And it's great that with all the work that you've done with just trying to connect it with people. And I think that's one of the best ways to just bring people together and not divide others. And I think the last question that I have is what specific resources do you think the people, the residents of New Hampshire, for all people, emphasizes on all people, should know so that they understand each other, they understand different communities, and that we can better understand each other and ourselves?
Oh boy. Resources. Well, Able New Hampshire is obviously a resource for folks to get involved and to get engaged. Um, Granite State Organizing Project in Manchester is an excellent organization doing incredible grassroots organizing alongside us. Um, and those are the two that I can think of right now, although there are many incredible organizations doing great work in New Hampshire. The Manchester chapter of the NAACP, there's a Black Lives Matters movement in Manchester. Some really good organizations are doing great work to get all of us who experience barriers to the American dream and an equity filled life, what we like to call belonging, right? Like all of us need to belong to our communities. It's beyond being included. Belonging doesn't have the feeling of a gatekeeper the way that inclusion does. So we're thrilled to be on that team, making sure that everyone belongs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking all of those different insights, Lisa. And yeah, I would like to say thank you so much for joining us, Executive Director Beaudoin, and I would like to, and for being our guest on NHLN Opinion Plus. Is there anything else that you would like to say for our lovely audience before we depart?
Just get involved in some way in a community organization doing good work, because there's so much work to be done. And if we're not all bending the moral arc of the universe, it's going to take us that much longer to get to justice. So thanks for having me on, and hope you have a great weekend.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa.
Thanks.
And join us for another episode in 2 weeks. For more information about our discussion today, check out our web story on nhlatinonewscom. Follow us on Twitter at NHLatinoNews and in our Instagram at NH_Latino News. I'm Bron Zapata with NHLN Opinion Plus, and we'll see you next time.